Let me ask you something. Have you ever worked so hard for something that you forgot to look up and check if the people around you were still there? Because that was me. That was my whole life.
Hi, I'm Ray. Welcome to my channel, Tales of the Heart by Ray. I am glad to have you as part of my community. Please comment where you are watching from. I would like to know. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more beautiful and interesting stories.
I grew up in Austin, Texas. Not the glamorous part people see in magazines or travel blogs, not the rooftop bars, not the music festivals, not the tech campuses shining like cathedrals in the sun. No. I grew up in the part of Austin that nobody posts about. The part where the rent was always 2 weeks away from being late. Where ambition felt like a foreign language that everyone around you quietly discouraged. Where dreaming too big was considered dangerous. Not because people were cruel, but because they'd been disappointed so many times. Hope itself felt reckless. My mother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry facility. My father left when I was 9, not dramatically, not violently. He just stopped coming home, like a light bulb that flickers for weeks before it finally goes dark. I remember the exact night I accepted he wasn't coming back. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, and I looked at his empty chair, and something in my chest just settled. Like my body made a decision my mind hadn't caught up to yet. He's gone. Keep going. That was the moment I became a builder. Not with tools, not with concrete, but with ideas, with code, with the relentless, stubborn, almost irrational belief that I could create something from nothing, that the right combination of logic and persistence could change a life. My life. And maybe one day the lives of others. By the time I was 24, I had taught myself 3 programming languages, launched 2 apps that failed spectacularly, and accumulated enough rejection emails from investors to wallpaper a small apartment, which, coincidentally, was exactly the size of the place I was living in. A 600-square-foot box in East Austin with a leaky faucet, a second-hand desk, and a whiteboard covered in diagrams that my few visitors politely pretended to understand. But I wasn't alone, not entirely, because I had Maya. Maya Chen had been my best friend since our sophomore year of college, the kind of friendship that forms not from convenience or circumstance, but from genuine, almost inexplicable recognition. Like meeting someone and thinking, without logic or reason, you're one of mine. She was studying design. I was studying computer science. We met at a campus study group that neither of us wanted to be at, bonded over our mutual disdain for the group's leader, and somehow never stopped talking after that. Maya was the kind of person who made you feel like the most important person in the room, not through flattery, not through performance, but through attention. She actually listened. She remembered things, small things, the way you liked your coffee, the name of the professor who failed you junior year, the dream you mentioned once in passing at 2 a.m. that you were almost embarrassed to say out loud. She held on to those things, quietly, like they mattered, because to her, they did. Through every failed app, every rejected pitch, every night I wanted to quit, Maya was there, not always with answers, sometimes just with presence, a message, a call, a knock on my apartment door with takeout containers, and the unspoken understanding that sometimes a person doesn't need advice. They just need to not be alone. I never told her how much that meant to me. I should have. But life has a way of making us assume that the people who always show up will always show up. That the ones who never leave don't need to be told they're loved. That some things don't need to be said because they're already understood. That assumption would cost me more than I can explain in words. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before the fall, there was Vanessa. Vanessa Reyes walked into my life at a networking event I almost didn't attend. One of those overcrowded, overpriced mixers where everyone is performing a version of themselves they hope will be mistaken for success. I was standing near the back, nursing a drink I didn't really want, wearing a shirt I'd ironed twice because I was nervous, rehearsing a pitch in my head like a prayer. And then she laughed. Not at me, just somewhere across the room. But the sound of it cut through the noise like a signal through static, and I turned without thinking. And there she was. Vanessa was the kind of beautiful that makes a room rearrange itself. Not just physically, though she was that, effortlessly. Dark hair, sharp eyes, the kind of posture that suggests she's never once doubted whether she belonged somewhere. But it was more than appearance. It was the way she commanded space. The way people leaned toward her when she spoke. The way she seemed to know, instinctively, the exact thing to say to make a person feel both seen and slightly off balance. She was confident in a way I had never been. And I, the quiet builder who had spent years talking to machines instead of people, was absolutely, helplessly drawn to her. We dated for a year before I proposed. And I want to be honest with you because this story deserves honesty. I loved her. I genuinely did. The way you love someone when you're still partly amazed they chose you. When you can't quite believe that this person, this radiant, magnetic, impossible person, looked at all the versions of who you could be and picked you. We got married on a Saturday in May. Small ceremony, big promises. And for a while, it was good. But for a while is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Because here's what I didn't see then. What I couldn't see, or maybe refused to. The relationship was never quite balanced. I was the one reaching, the one compromising, the one who adjusted his schedule, his habits, his dreams, all to make space for her, and she received it graciously, beautifully, but she never quite reached back. I told myself it was because she expressed love differently, that her confidence was simply how she moved through the world, that the occasional distance I felt between us was just the natural friction of two strong personalities sharing one life. I was wrong, but I wouldn't know how wrong for another 4 years. Those 4 years, they were a marathon, a brutal, beautiful, lonely marathon. Every morning I woke up before sunrise. Every night I fell asleep at my desk. I built a new app, different from the others, smarter, more focused, something that genuinely solved a problem in a way nobody else had solved it yet. And slowly, painfully slowly, it started to gain traction. Not viral, not overnight, but real, steady. The kind of growth that serious people pay attention to. Investors started calling back, not rejecting, calling back. I remember the first time I looked at the numbers on a pitch deck and thought, this might actually work. It really works, life-changing work. And instead of celebrating, I sat quietly at my desk in that same small apartment, pressed my palms flat on the surface, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. I didn't tell Vanessa the full scale of what was happening. Not yet. I wanted to be sure. I had been close before and watched it crumble. I couldn't bear to get her hopes up, or mine only to fall again. So I kept working, quietly, and I waited. Meanwhile, somewhere in a life parallel to mine, my twin brother Evan was doing what Evan always did. Evan Cole was my mirror and my opposite. Same face, same blood, completely different frequency. Where I moved slowly and deliberately, Evan moved like a flash fire. Where I saved, he spent. Where I planned, he improvised. And somehow, the universe consistently rewarded him for it. Money seemed to find Evan the way water finds low ground, effortlessly, inevitably, without apology. We had been close as children, inseparable even, two halves of a whole. But as adults, the distance between us grew in the quiet way that distances often do. Not through arguments or falling outs, but through the slow accumulation of separate lives. Different circles, different cities for stretches of time, phone calls that got shorter, visits that got rarer. I told myself it was just life, just the natural drift of two people growing up and growing apart. I had no idea at all. It was the morning of our 4th wedding anniversary when I got the call confirming the meeting. The meeting I had been working toward for 3 years, the one that could change everything. I kissed Vanessa on the cheek, told her I had a work thing, promised I'd be back early. She smiled and told me not to work too hard. I remember thinking, as I walked to my car that morning, that things were finally coming together, that the sacrifices were worth it, that the silence and the grind and the lonely nights were all part of a story that was about to turn a corner. And they were, just not in the way I imagined. Because by the time I returned home that evening, with roses, with a diamond necklace, with $3 million and a heart full of hope, everything I thought I knew was already gone. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. You don't want to miss what is about to happen. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. No warning, no soundtrack, no slow build of dramatic music telling you to brace for impact. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary seconds, and then detonate inside you so completely that everything before them suddenly feels like a different lifetime. I have replayed that evening 10,000 times in my mind. The drive home, the windows down, the warm Austin air moving through the car like it had somewhere to be. I remember the roses on the passenger seat, white, her favorite, wrapped in brown paper with a thin gold ribbon I had asked the florist to tie twice because the first one didn't look right. I remember the necklace box in my jacket pocket. Small, velvet, heavier than it looked. I remember the radio playing something I can't name anymore because the memory of sound from that night has been completely overwritten by what came after. I was happy, genuinely, fully, unsuspectingly happy. And that is the detail that still cuts the deepest, not what I found, not what I lost, but the fact that in those final minutes before everything collapsed, I was smiling. Alone in my car, $3 million richer, married to a woman I loved, driving home to surprise her. And I was smiling like a man who had finally, after years of silence and sacrifice, earned the right to exhale. The universe has a cruel sense of timing. I turned onto our street just as the sun was beginning to lower itself behind the tree line, painting everything in that particular shade of amber that makes even ordinary neighborhoods look cinematic. Our house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, nothing extravagant but ours, a double story with a dark front door and a garden Vanessa had insisted on but rarely tended. I had maintained it myself, quietly, without complaint, the way I maintained most things in our life, and that is when I saw it. The car, parked just slightly off the driveway, angled in the casual way of someone who didn't expect to be there long, or someone who had stopped caring whether they were seen. A black Audi RS7, custom matte wrap, personalized plates. I knew that car the way you know your own reflection. It belonged to my brother, Evan. I pulled up slowly and sat for a moment with the engine running, staring at it. My brain, the same brain that had spent years solving complex problems, debugging systems, mapping out variables and contingencies, immediately began doing what it always does under pressure. It started building explanations, reasonable ones, logical ones. Maybe he was in the neighborhood. Maybe he wanted to surprise us for the anniversary. Maybe Vanessa had invited him and forgotten to mention it. The mind is extraordinarily loyal to the version of reality it has invested in. It will fight hard to protect the story you've been living, even when the evidence is standing right there in your driveway wearing custom plates. I turned off the engine, picked up the roses, stepped out. The air felt different the moment my feet hit the pavement. I don't know how else to describe it. Like the atmosphere itself had shifted while I was in the car. Like the neighborhood had exhaled and was now holding its breath, watching, waiting. I walked to the front door, put my key in the lock, pushed it open, and the silence hit me. Not peaceful silence. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty house. This was different. This was the silence of a space that had recently been loud, recently been alive with something, and had just gone still. Like a stage after a curtain drops. The absence of sound so deliberate, so sudden, that it echoes. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. The house looked the same, everything in its place. The console table near the entrance with the ceramic vase Vanessa, bought at a market we visited in our first year of marriage. The framed photo of our wedding day on the wall. Me in my suit, her in that white dress, both of us looking at the camera with the wide-eyed optimism of people who don't yet know what time does to promises. The kitchen light was on, a half-empty glass of wine on the counter. 2 glasses. I almost missed it. Almost, but I didn't. I set the roses down on the console table, slowly. The way you put something down when your hands have started to tremble but you don't want to acknowledge why yet. I moved through the living room, past the couch, past the television, down the hallway. And with every step, my chest grew heavier. There's a particular kind of knowing that lives below thought, below logic, below all the reasonable explanations your brain constructs to protect you. It lives somewhere older than reason, in the gut, in the blood, in whatever part of a human being existed before language was invented to dress up truth. And that part of me already knew, had known perhaps from the moment I saw the car. I just wasn't ready to know it yet. The bedroom door was not fully closed, just slightly ajar, enough that a thin line of light escaped from the gap, cutting across the hallway floor like a blade. I stopped in front of it, one hand raised, and in that half second before I pushed it open, that tiny suspended fragment of before, I had a thought so clear it almost sounded spoken aloud in the hallway. Whatever is on the other side of this door is going to change everything. I pushed it open, and there they were. I will not describe it in detail. Not because I'm protecting anyone. They forfeited that right long ago. But because some images don't need elaboration. Some truths arrive in a single frame and carry more weight than 1,000 words could hold. My wife, my brother, my bed. The world didn't spin. I didn't stagger. I didn't grab the doorframe or make a sound. I've heard people describe moments of shock as dramatic, collapsing, screaming, throwing things. But for me, it was the opposite. Everything went very, very still, like my entire nervous system received the signal and simply paused, rebooted, tried to make sense of data it had no framework to process. Vanessa saw me first. Her face, God, her face in that moment. I have tried so many times to interpret what I saw there. Shock, yes, but also something else. Something layered and complicated that, with the distance of time, I now understand was not just guilt. It was the specific terror of someone whose carefully constructed world has just cracked open in real time. Ethan. Her voice, my name, the way she said it, urgent, reaching, as if the right combination of syllables could somehow reassemble what I was looking at into something explainable. It's not what it looks like. I have heard that sentence replayed in 100 conversations since, in movies, in other people's stories. And every time I hear it, I think the same thing. It is perhaps the most dishonest sentence in the human language, because it is always, without exception, exactly what it looks like. I looked at Evan. He didn't say anything. My brother, the loud one, the flashy one, the man who always had something to say about everything, looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not guilt, not defiance, something closer to collapse. Like the version of himself he had been performing for years had just stopped working, and underneath it was someone he didn't recognize any better than I did. We stared at each other across that room for what felt like a full minute and might have been 3 seconds. And then I turned around. No shouting, no confrontation, no broken dishes or slammed doors or anything that might have felt, in the movies, like justice. I just walked away. Because some betrayals don't deserve the dignity of your rage. Some wounds are so deep that screaming at them would feel like performing, like giving an audience to people who have already taken enough from you. My silence was not weakness. It was the only thing I had left that was still entirely mine, and I kept it. I walked back down the hallway, past the wedding photo, past the ceramic vase. I picked up the roses from the console table. I don't know why, I just did, and I walked out the front door. I sat in my car for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. I watched the numbers change on the dashboard display and felt absolutely nothing, which was the most frightening feeling of all. Like someone had reached into my chest and simply switched something off. The necklace was still in my jacket pocket. The roses were in my lap. $3 million were sitting in an account with my name on it. And I was the loneliest person on earth. I started the car. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove through the amber-lit streets of Austin, past the parks, past the coffee shops, past the world that was still casually, insultingly continuing to exist as if nothing had happened. And I drove the way people drive when they need movement because stillness is unbearable. When forward feels like the only direction that won't destroy you. 20 minutes later, I was parked outside a small apartment building in South Austin. I sat for a moment, then I got out, walked up to the second floor, knocked on a blue door I had knocked on more times than I could count. Through exam failures and funding rejections and every moment life had decided to be unkind, the door opened, and Maya looked at me, just looked at me. Her eyes moving across my face the way someone reads an urgent message, quickly, carefully, not missing a single word. She took in the roses I was still inexplicably carrying, the flatness in my eyes, the way my jaw was set, the particular stillness of a man who has cried everything he has and is now just hollow. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't say anything at all. She just stepped aside, held the door open, and let me in. And the moment I crossed that threshold, the moment I was inside that small, warm, honest space that smelled like her candles and her coffee and her absolute, unwavering realness, something cracked open in my chest that I hadn't even realized was sealed. I sat on her couch, and I broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. She sat beside me, said nothing, put her hand over mine, and in that silence, in that simple, unremarkable human gesture, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, safe. And if I had been paying attention, really paying attention, I might have recognized that feeling for what it was. Not just comfort, not just friendship, something deeper, something that had been quietly, patiently, faithfully growing in the space between us for years, waiting for me to be ready to see it. But that night, I wasn't ready. That night, I was just a man who had driven home with roses and a ring and a future, and returned with nothing but questions. Questions that, over the coming days, would reveal answers so much darker than even that bedroom scene had prepared me for. Because what I saw that evening, that was only the surface. And what lived underneath it was going to change everything. There is a particular kind of pain that doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in stages, like a building that has been quietly compromised from the inside. The foundation cracked, the walls weakened, the structure hollowed out, and then one day, without dramatic warning, it simply comes down. And as you stand in the rubble, you realize the collapse didn't happen today. It happened slowly, over months, over years, while you were looking somewhere else. That was what the next 72 hours felt like. Not one wound, 1,000 small ones arriving in sequence. I slept on Maya's couch that first night. Or rather, I lay on Maya's couch. Sleep was something that happened to other people. I stared at her ceiling in the dark and did what my mind has always done under pressure. I went back, replayed, rewound, pulled up memories like files on a hard drive, and examined them with the new, terrible clarity of someone who finally has the missing context. The business trips Vanessa took that I never questioned. 3 in the past 2 years, Nashville, Denver, New Orleans. She said they were with her friend group, girls' trips. I had been so buried in work that I hadn't even thought to ask for details. I just wired money into our joint account for her expenses and went back to my screen. The gifts. There was a bracelet she came home with last spring, rose gold, delicate, clearly expensive. She told me she'd treated herself. I remembered thinking it was slightly out of our budget range at the time, but saying nothing because I didn't want to make her feel restricted. I wanted her to feel cared for, even indirectly. The late evenings she spent at her friend Danny's place. The shifted energy, barely noticeable at first, the way she had slowly, almost imperceptibly, stopped reaching for my hand in public, stopped initiating conversations about our future, stopped asking about my work with the genuine curiosity she'd had in the beginning. I had chalked it up to the natural settling of a long relationship, the comfortable distance that forms between two people who know each other so well that effort feels unnecessary. I was such a fool. Not because I trusted. Trust is not foolishness. Trust is the architecture of love. Remove it and the whole structure becomes uninhabitable. No, I was a fool because I kept choosing the comfortable explanation when the uncomfortable one was quietly, persistently presenting itself. I had mistaken my own loyalty for perception, confused the fact that I would never betray her with evidence that she would never betray me. Those are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing. By morning, Maya had made coffee and set it beside me without a word. She sat in the armchair across from me, feet tucked beneath her, hands wrapped around her mug, and waited, not impatiently, not with the barely concealed urgency of someone who needs to know the story so they can respond to it, just waited. The way Maya always waited. Like she had all the time in the world and you were worth every second of it. I told her everything, and as the words came out, slow at first, then faster, then all at once, in a flood I couldn't stop, I watched her face do something extraordinary. It didn't perform shock. It didn't arrange itself into the exaggerated expressions of someone reacting for an audience. It just received, absorbed. Her eyes stayed steady and soft, and the only moment something shifted in them was when I mentioned Evan. Something moved across her face then, brief, controlled, like a door opening and immediately closing. I noticed it, filed it away, but in my state that morning I had no capacity to ask. "How long do you think it's been going on?" she said quietly when I was done. I shook my head. "I don't know, but it didn't feel like the beginning." She nodded slowly, said nothing more. She didn't need to, because we both understood what that meant. The answer came 3 days later. I had moved into a short-term rental, a furnished studio near downtown that felt like a waiting room. Neutral walls, generic furniture, the specific loneliness of a space that belongs to no one. I sat at the small desk by the window each night, my laptop open, not building anything for the first time in years, just thinking, unraveling. On the 3rd night, I received a message from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't open it, but something made me. It was a woman named Carla. She identified herself as someone who worked at a hotel in Nashville, the one Vanessa had stayed at during her first girls' trip 17 months ago. Carla had seen my name mentioned in a news piece about my company's growing success, a small tech blog article that had made quiet rounds in Austin business circles. She said she recognized the last name, said she had something I deserved to know. She sent me photos, hotel check-in records, one room, booked under Evan Cole. occupied by 2 guests. Check-in date matching Vanessa's girls' trip to the day. I sat at that desk for a long time after reading it. Then I went further, because once you pull the first thread, the rest unravels whether you're ready or not. I hired a private investigator, something I never imagined doing, something that felt like a plot point from someone else's life. Within a week, he had built a picture so thorough and so devastating that I had to read it in pieces because absorbing it all at once was physiologically impossible. 3 years, not months, not a handful of reckless moments. 3 years. It had started quietly, the way all hidden things start, with small moments that could still at the time be plausibly explained. A lunch, a call, the gradual, deliberate dismantling of the boundary between what was acceptable and what was not. And then, somewhere in that slow progression, a line was crossed, and then another, and then the lies required to maintain it compounded until they had built an entire parallel life. Vanessa and Evan had traveled together at least 7 times. 7. They had a shared communication channel, an app I had never heard of, designed for encrypted messaging, the kind of thing you use when concealment is the entire point. They had, according to my investigators' findings, discussed my work, my pitches, my financial situation, the state of my deals. That last part stopped me cold. They hadn't just betrayed me personally. They had been watching me professionally, monitoring my progress. And what I realized, slowly, sickeningly, was that Evan had known about my final deal before it closed. He had connections in the investment world I didn't. And while I cannot prove with absolute certainty what I believe happened next, what I believe, in my bones, is that he had tried quietly to undermine it, to slow it down, to keep me exactly where I was, struggling, distracted, dependent, while he lived the life he was living with my wife behind my back. He didn't want me to succeed, because my success would change the dynamic, and the dynamic, for 3 years, had been working perfectly in his favor. I remember the specific moment this understanding settled into my body. I was sitting in my rental studio, the investigator's report open on my laptop, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not more pain. I was beyond the geography of pain by this point. What I felt was something colder and quieter. Clarity. The particular, irreversible clarity that arrives when every illusion has been removed, and you are finally, seeing the actual shape of your life. My brother hadn't drifted away from me because of busy schedules and separate lives. He had made a choice, a sustained, deliberate, years-long choice, and my wife had made it with him. I filed for divorce 8 days after the night I came home with roses. The papers were served on a Tuesday morning. I was not present. I sat in a coffee shop across town and drank an Americano and watched strangers live their ordinary lives and thought about how extraordinary ordinary felt from where I was sitting. Vanessa called within the hour. I didn't answer. She called 11 more times that day. I watched my phone light up and go dark, like a warning signal from a world I was no longer part of. That evening she texted, "Please, Ethan, can we just talk? I know what I did. I know, but please don't do this. Please." I read it once, put the phone face down on the table, and went back to my coffee. Because here is what nobody tells you about the moment you decide to walk away from something that has broken you. It doesn't feel powerful. It doesn't feel like victory or resolution or any of the emotionally satisfying conclusions you might imagine in the abstract. It feels quiet, heavy, like closing a book you loved that turned out to have a different ending than the one you were promised. But it also feels necessary. And necessity, even painful necessity, carries its own strange peace. What I did not anticipate, what genuinely blindsided me, even in the wreckage of everything else, was what happened the moment Vanessa's lawyer made contact. The divorce filing had been straightforward. I had grounds. I had documentation. I had the investigator's full report and the hotel records and the encrypted message logs that my legal team had obtained through proper channels. Open and shut, I thought. Painful but clean. I was wrong. Because the moment Vanessa's attorney sent the first correspondence, the word that appeared, the word that reoriented the entire situation in one syllable, was one I should have seen coming but didn't. Assets. She wanted half. Not half of what existed when we married. Not half of what had been built together, collaboratively, in the spirit of a shared life. She wanted half of the $3 million. Half of my company's current valuation. Half of everything that had been built in silence and sacrifice and sleepless nights and years of rejection that she had witnessed. and that her partner in deception had tried to prevent. She wanted half of my future, and her lawyer's argument was constructed with a specific, calculated audacity, that during the marriage, Vanessa had provided emotional and domestic support that had enabled my professional success, that her presence in my life had been a form of contribution, that I had been, in her telling, emotionally unavailable and professionally obsessive, and that she had endured this and deserved compensation for it. I sat in my attorney's office and listened to this argument read aloud, and I felt something shift inside me, not toward anger, though anger was present, toward something harder, something that had been soft for too long. "What do we have?" I said. My attorney, a sharp, measured woman named Patricia, who had the energy of someone who had heard every version of every story and was never surprised, looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "Everything," she said. "We have everything." And she was right. The messages, the hotel records, the financial trail showing that Evan had been supplementing Vanessa's lifestyle, gifts, trips, expenses throughout the affair, the timeline of deception laid against the timeline of my professional sacrifice, the encrypted communications, the testimony from Carla and 2 other hotel staff members who had, once the story began to circulate quietly, reached out voluntarily. We had the truth, all of it, documented, verified, chronological. And the truth, it turned out, was more than enough. But the courtroom was still ahead. And before we got there, before the gavel and the rulings and the moment the entire constructed narrative Vanessa had built about herself finally, publicly came apart, there was one more discovery waiting for me. One more layer beneath the layer I thought was the bottom. Something about Evan. Something about money. Something that connected dots I hadn't even known needed connecting. And when I found it, I understood for the first time the full architecture of what had been done to me. Not just the betrayal of a wife, not just the betrayal of a brother, but a calculated, coordinated dismantling, years in the making, of a man they both believed would never rise high enough to see it from above. They were wrong. I rose. And from up here, I could see everything. Imagine his twin brother going all the way just to bring his brother down. It is really sad. Comment below how you feel about his wife and twin brother. I am here to read all your comments and also comment the country you are watching from. I would really love to meet you all. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more of this stories. Let's continue. There is something uniquely exposing about a courtroom. Not just for the person on trial, not just for the accused or the defending, or the ones whose lives are being measured and weighed by strangers in formal clothing. For everyone inside those walls. Because a courtroom strips language of its social lubrication, the polite ambiguities, the careful omissions, the versions of truth we curate for different audiences, and demands something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The undecorated facts, just the facts, all of them, in sequence, out loud. I had never been inside a courtroom before that morning. I had built my life in quiet rooms, apartments, offices, server closets, the kind of spaces where ambition hums along privately, unseen. But now I was sitting at a long table in a room that smelled like old wood and institutional carpet, wearing a suit I had bought specifically for this occasion, next to my attorney Patricia, watching the door through which Vanessa would walk. And when she did walk in, I want to be precise about what I felt, because it matters, not hatred, not the hot, consuming fury that people expect when they imagine a man in my position sitting across from the woman who had dismantled 4 years of his life. What I felt was something more complicated and, in some ways, more painful than hatred. I felt the specific grief of recognition, of looking at someone you once loved completely and seeing them clearly, perhaps for the first time, and understanding that the person you loved was always partly a projection, a story you told yourself. And the real person, the one sitting 12 feet away in a burgundy blazer, with her attorney's hand briefly on her arm, was someone you were only now beginning to actually meet. She looked composed. That was the first thing I noticed, not guilty, not broken, composed, hair perfect. Expression calibrated to project something between dignity and quiet suffering. The visual language of a woman who has been wronged, performed for a room full of people who didn't yet know the full picture. She was good at it. I had to give her that. She always had been. The first 2 sessions were procedural. Filings, counterfilings. The slow institutional machinery of family law grinding through its necessary motions. Patricia had warned me this part would feel frustrating, like watching someone take apart a clock before they could tell you the time. She was right. I sat through it with my hands flat on the table and my face deliberately neutral and thought about code, about systems, about the fact that every complex problem, no matter how chaotic it appears on the surface, has an underlying structure, a logic. And if you can find the logic, you can find the solution. Vanessa's attorney was a man named Gerald Fitch, mid-50s, silver hair worn with the confidence of someone who has used it to his advantage in front of judges for 3 decades. He had the particular manner of a person who believes that presentation is more than half of argument, that if you say something smoothly enough, with enough authority, the content becomes almost secondary. He opened their case with a narrative. Ethan Cole, he said, was a man so consumed by professional ambition that he had been functionally absent from his marriage for years. A man who chose screens over his spouse, meetings over connection, code over conversation. Vanessa, in this telling, was not a woman who had betrayed her husband. She was a woman who had been slowly, systemically abandoned by one, and who had, in her loneliness and emotional neglect, made a terrible mistake for which she was deeply remorseful. He used the word neglect 7 times in his opening. I counted. I sat and listened and kept my face still and thought, keep going, keep building it. Because everything you construct in this room, we are about to take apart piece by piece. When Patricia stood, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform outrage or deploy the theatrical gravity that Fitch had used like a stage prop. She simply walked to the center of the room, looked at the judge, a measured woman in her 60s named Judge Renee Hargrove, who had the eyes of someone who had heard every story twice, and said, "Your Honor, we will demonstrate that the narrative just presented is not only false, but is the deliberate inversion of a documented truth. We will show this court not a neglected wife, but a planned deception, not an emotional mistake, but a 3-year coordinated betrayal. And we will do so not with characterization, not with sympathy, but with evidence." She paused. Verifiable, time-stamped, irrefutable evidence. The room was very quiet after that. The evidence came in stages, and each stage was its own specific devastation. First, the hotel records. Patricia presented them methodically. Dates, locations, booking names, room configurations. 7 trips, 7 locations across 4 states, each one cross-referenced against Vanessa's claimed alibi for that period. Nashville, Denver, New Orleans, Scottsdale, Chicago, Miami, Portland. Each trip a lie, each lie documented. Fitch objected twice during this portion. Both objections were overruled. Second, the financial records. This was the part I had not fully anticipated the impact of, even knowing what they contained. Because seeing numbers on a page is different from hearing them read aloud in a formal setting, in sequence, by a calm and precise attorney who pauses after each figure to let it settle. Evan had transferred money to accounts connected to Vanessa 31 times over the course of 3 years. Some small, a few $100s, some significant, transfers in the thousands. The total, when Patricia read it aloud, landed in the room like something physical. Across the table, I saw Vanessa's jaw tighten fractionally, the first crack in the composure. Third, the communications. This required the most legal navigation. The encrypted messages had been obtained through a process Patricia had been meticulous about ensuring was above challenge. The content itself was not read in full. Instead, Patricia presented excerpts, selected, targeted, chosen not for sensationalism but for precision. Messages that established timeline. Messages that established intent. Messages between Vanessa and Evan that referenced me, my work, my deals, my progress, in terms that made the temperature of the room drop several degrees. There was one message in particular. I had read it before. In the investigator's report. In the privacy of my rental studio at 2 in the morning, with no one to see my face when it landed. But hearing it read aloud in a courtroom, in Patricia's measured, unhurried voice, was a different experience entirely. It was a message from Evan to Vanessa, sent 14 months ago, 3 weeks before my final deal nearly fell apart due to a last-minute investor hesitation that had seemed at the time inexplicable. The message said, "Don't worry, he's not going anywhere. Keep him steady. I'll handle the rest." The room went very still. Judge Hargrove looked up from her notes. Vanessa looked at the table, and something cold moved through me. Not new pain, but the confirmation of something I had suspected but hadn't wanted to fully believe. That they hadn't just been living a lie alongside my life. They had been, at moments, actively reaching into my life and manipulating it, keeping me manageable. keeping me close enough to maintain the cover of a marriage while distant enough to not notice what was happening. They had used my love against me, and they had almost used it to derail everything I had built. Almost. Fitch attempted a recovery. He was skilled enough to try, and I respected the effort the way you respect the structural integrity of a building that is clearly coming down. There is something almost admirable about how long it holds before the inevitable. He argued that the communications were taken out of context, that the financial transfers were personal loans between family members, that Evan, as Ethan's brother, had a long history of financial generosity, that the hotel records, while damaging in appearance, did not conclusively establish the nature of the relationship. He was building with sand. He knew it. Patricia knew it. Judge Hargrove knew it. But he was being paid to build, so he built. It was during the second day of proceedings that the moment happened, the moment I had not planned for and could not have scripted. Vanessa was on the stand. Patricia was questioning her, calm, methodical, moving through the timeline with the patience of someone who has all day and knows exactly where she is going. And then she asked a question that seemed, on the surface, almost benign. Mrs. Cole, during the period between January of the year prior and the date of separation, can you describe your relationship with your brother-in-law, Evan Cole? Vanessa had prepared for this. You could see it. The slight straightening, the breath she took, the way her eyes moved briefly to Fitch before returning to Patricia with practiced steadiness. We were family, she said. We had a close family relationship. Patricia nodded, turned, retrieved a document from the table. Would you characterize a message reading? And I quote, she looked at the page. I keep thinking about New Orleans, about the last night. I don't want to keep pretending this is nothing, as consistent with a family relationship. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Vanessa's composure, the thing she had maintained through 2 full days of proceedings, through documentation and financial records and hotel logs, cracked. Not dramatically, not visibly to everyone in the room, but I saw it. I was watching for it, and I saw it, in the slight parting of her lips, in the way her eyes went somewhere else for just a moment, somewhere private and desperate, before coming back, in the barely perceptible exhale. She started. Fitch said, objection. Hargrove said, overruled. The witness will answer. Another silence. It was a complicated time, Vanessa said finally, quietly. There were feelings that were inappropriate, and I'm not proud of them. Were these feelings acted upon? Patricia asked. Vanessa looked at her hands. Yes, she said. One word. And the entire constructed narrative, the neglected wife, the emotionally abandoned woman, the reluctant participant in her own story, disintegrated in a single syllable. Judge Hargrove issued her ruling 9 days later. I was in Patricia's office when the call came, sitting in a leather chair across from her desk, watching her face as she listened, watching for the signal, the slight shift of expression that would tell me which way it had gone before the words did. She looked up at me halfway through the call, and she nodded once. I looked out the window. Austin spread below us, the city that had watched me fail and start again and fail and start again and keep going. The city where I had taught myself to code in a small apartment, where I had married a woman I loved, where I had built something real from absolutely nothing. The ruling was comprehensive. Vanessa received a fraction of what she had claimed, a basic settlement accounting for the length of the marriage. Nothing more. The evidence of sustained deception eliminated her claim to my professional assets entirely. The financial records connecting Evan to the affair and to potential interference in my business dealings were referred to an additional legal review. She did not get half. She did not get anywhere near half. She got what remained after the truth had been accounted for, which, it turned out, was very little. I walked out of that building into afternoon sunlight and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. People moved around me, going places, carrying things, living the efficient, purposeful lives of people who had somewhere to be. And I stood still in the middle of it and waited for the feeling I thought would come. Victory, relief, closure. But it didn't come. Not any of those things. Not the way I had imagined them. Instead, what came was quiet. An enormous, heavy, honest quiet. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about winning a battle you never wanted to fight. You are still standing in the ruins of something. The verdict doesn't rebuild what was destroyed. The truth being acknowledged doesn't return the years. The ruling doesn't restore the version of your brother you thought you had. It doesn't give back the mornings you woke up beside someone you believed was yours. It doesn't unhollow the memory of a marriage you gave everything to. Winning just means the war is over. It does not mean you aren't still standing in the damage it left behind. I called Maya on the walk back to my car. She answered on the second ring the way she always did. "How did it go?" she said. And I said, "It's done." And she said, "Okay, come over. I'll make dinner." No celebration, no dramatic exhale, no performance of what this moment was supposed to feel like. Just, "Come over. I'll make dinner." And somehow, in all the noise and grief and wreckage of the previous weeks, those 6 words were the most stabilizing thing anyone had said to me. I got in my car, and I drove toward the only place that had consistently felt like solid ground. But even as I drove, even in that moment of exhaled relief, something was shifting. Something that had been building slowly beneath everything else, beneath the betrayal and the lawyers and the courtroom and the evidence and the ruling, was rising. A question. Not about Vanessa, not about Evan, not about the past, about the future, about what a man does, who he becomes, after everything he built to protect himself has proven insufficient, after the walls he constructed turned out to have cracks he couldn't see, after the people he trusted most used that trust as a door. What do you build next? And more importantly, who do you build it with? The answer, I was beginning to understand, had been sitting in a second-floor apartment in South Austin for years, quietly, patiently, waiting for me to finally see it. Healing is not an event. Nobody tells you that. Or maybe they do. Maybe someone somewhere along the way says the words, but you don't actually understand them until you are living inside the process. Until you are the person waking up each morning and taking inventory of yourself the way you might assess a structure after a storm, checking each wall, each beam, each foundation point, and asking, what is still standing? What needs work? What has gone beyond repair? I had won in the courtroom. I had the money. I had the company. I had the legal vindication of a truth that had been documented, verified, and read aloud before a judge who had seen through every constructed narrative Vanessa and her attorney had attempted to build. By every external measure, I had won, and yet, every morning I woke in that furnished studio with its neutral walls and its generic furniture. There was a window of approximately 4 seconds, right at the border between sleep and full consciousness, where I forgot, where my mind, not yet fully online, hadn't yet loaded the updated version of my life, where I was just Ethan, just a man waking up. And in those 4 seconds, everything felt normal. Then the 5th second arrived, and I remembered, and the day began. It was Maya who first suggested I stop living in the studio. Not dramatically, not as an intervention or a serious sit-down conversation with carefully chosen words. The way Maya did most things, lightly, sideways, almost as an afterthought, in a manner that left you feeling like the idea had been your own. We were sitting on her apartment floor one evening. She was working on a design project, papers and color swatches spread around her like a textile explosion, and I was on my laptop doing something I can't even remember now, when she looked up and said, without preamble, "You know that studio is making you worse." I looked up. "It's fine," I said. "It's beige," she said. "Everything in it is beige." "You've been beige for 6 weeks, Ethan." And despite everything, despite the heaviness that had taken up permanent residence somewhere in my chest, I laughed. It was the first real laugh. Not a polite social noise, not the performed version of humor that you deploy to reassure people you're okay, but an actual laugh. Unexpected, unguarded, arriving from somewhere genuine. Maya looked at me when it happened, just for a moment, and something moved across her face, brief and quiet and quickly composed, that I filed away without yet knowing what to do with it. "There are apartments in this building," she said, returning to her color swatches. "3rd floor has one opening up next month. You should look at it." And that was that. I moved into the 3rd floor apartment 6 weeks later. What followed was a period of my life that I have come to think of as the rebuilding season. Not rebuilding in the dramatic montage sequence sense. Not a man emerging from tragedy in a blaze of triumphant reinvention. More quiet than that, more honest. The kind of rebuilding that happens in small, unremarkable daily increments that you don't notice accumulating until one day you look back and realize you are standing somewhere significantly different from where you started. I threw myself back into work, not out of avoidance this time, or not entirely, but because building was genuinely the thing that made me feel most like myself. The new projects I was developing were more ambitious than anything I had attempted before. and the capital from the first deal gave me the freedom to pursue them on my own terms, without the particular desperation that had colored my earlier years. But something was different this time. I worked with more intention, more awareness. I had spent years building with my eyes down, focused entirely on the screen in front of me, on the problem immediately at hand, and the cost of that tunnel vision had become catastrophically clear. So I started lifting my eyes more, paying attention to the periphery, to the people, to the things happening just outside the frame of whatever task was consuming me. And the first thing I saw when I started paying attention was Maya, not as a new discovery. She had always been there, this I knew, this I had always known. But there is a difference between knowing someone is there and actually seeing them, between taking comfort in a presence and truly observing the person producing it. I started noticing things I had cataloged but never examined. The way she approached problems, not directly, the way I did, but from angles, circling until she found the entry point that made the most sense aesthetically and functionally both. She was a designer by training and by nature, and the design sensibility extended beyond her work into the way she moved through the world. She arranged her space thoughtfully. She chose her words with care. She never said anything she didn't mean, and she never meant anything she didn't eventually say. I noticed the way she was with other people, patient in a way that wasn't passive, attentive in a way that wasn't intrusive, the way she could sit with someone in their worst moment and not try to fix it, just be present for it, and how that presence, that simple sustained showing up, was often more valuable than any solution. I noticed the way she laughed, not the careful, socially calibrated version that many people deploy in professional or semi-public settings, but the real one. The one that arrived when something genuinely surprised her into amusement. It was the kind of laugh that made you want to be funnier. Not because you wanted to perform, but because you wanted to be the reason it happened again. And I noticed, slowly, resistantly, with the particular reluctance of a man who had recently had his entire emotional infrastructure demolished and was not remotely ready to consider rebuilding it, that being in her presence was the only time the heaviness in my chest genuinely lifted. Not numbed, not suppressed, lifted, as in gone, as in the weight actually left. I told myself it was friendship. The comfort of a long, trusted relationship in a period of significant personal upheaval. The natural closeness of two people who had always been close, now sharing a building, spending more time together by proximity and habit. I told myself this for approximately 3 months. Then something happened that made it much harder to maintain that story. It was a Thursday evening in late autumn, the kind of evening where Austin remembers it is capable of being cold, where the air has an edge, and the light goes early, and everything feels slightly more interior, more inward than usual. Maya had come down to my apartment after work with takeout containers and the unspoken understanding that we would eat together, as we had fallen into doing most evenings. She was telling me about a client meeting, something about a rebrand that had gone sideways in a specific and absurd way that I won't detail here, but which required several digressions and a visual demonstration involving a takeout chopstick. And I was listening, leaning back against the couch cushions, watching her talk. And in the middle of a sentence, she laughed, the real one, the unguarded one, and something happened in my chest that I had absolutely no prepared response for. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a thunderclap or a revelation, or any of the cinematic shorthand we use to describe the moment a person realizes something significant. It was smaller than that, quieter, like a key turning in a lock that had been there for years, that you'd walked past every single day, and you were only now noticing the sound it made. I went very still. Maya, mid-law, caught the stillness. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. She looked at me for a moment with those steady, perceptive eyes that never missed anything, never had, not in all the years I'd known her, and I had the distinct, slightly terrifying feeling that she could see exactly what I was thinking. "Okay," she said, and she went back to her story. But something had shifted, in the room, in me, in the specific quality of the air between us. I lay awake that night for a long time, not in the dark, grief-soaked way of the previous months, not the insomnia of a man replaying his losses. This was different. This was the wide awakeness of someone whose mind is working on something new, turning it over, examining it from different angles. I thought about every time Maya had been there, not abstractly, concretely, specifically. The college library at midnight, the takeout during failed pitches, the The couch where I broke down after coming home with roses. Every phone call answered on the second ring. Every door opened without question. Every moment she had shown up, consistently, quietly, without fanfare or expectation or the need for reciprocity. Across the full length of a friendship that was now, I was realizing, among the most significant relationships of my life. And I thought about something she had said to me years ago that I had stored without knowing why. We had been in our final year of college, sitting on a campus benches after an end-of-year party neither of us had particularly enjoyed. I was talking about what I wanted, the company, the impact, the life I was trying to build. And she had listened, and then said quietly, "I think when you find what you're really building toward, Ethan, not just professionally, but in your whole life, I think it's going to be something real, something that actually lasts." At the time, I had taken it as general encouragement, friend support. Lying there in the dark on a Thursday night in autumn, I heard it differently. I heard everything in it that I had missed the first time. I didn't say anything for weeks. Not because I was calculating. I have never been good at calculation in matters that aren't strictly logical, but because the situation required care, required a quality of attention and honesty that I hadn't always brought to the important things in my life. And I was determined to do it differently this time. To not rush, to not need, to not bring my damage to her door and call it love. So I was present. I was honest. I let things move at the speed they naturally moved. And slowly, the way seasons change, so gradually you can't name the exact moment autumn became winter, things between us deepened. A conversation that went later than intended. An evening walk that became a habit. A moment where our hands, reaching for the same thing, simply stayed in contact for a beat longer than usual, and neither of us moved away. Small things. But in my experience, the important things are almost always small. The monumental, life-defining moments are usually just small things that you are finally ready to see clearly. One night, it was a Saturday, cold, the city outside making its weekend sounds. We were sitting on her apartment floor in a configuration that had become familiar. Her with her work, me with mine. The easy silence of two people who had long since stopped needing to fill every gap with noise. And I put down what I was working on. And I said her name. She looked up, and I said, "I need to tell you something. And I need you to know before I say it that I'm not saying it because I'm lonely, or because I've been through something hard, and you were there. I know the difference. I know it because I've spent the last 3 months making absolutely sure I know it." She was very still. "I see you, Maya," I said. "I finally see you. Not just as the person who was always there, but why you were always there. And why being around you is the only time in recent memory that I have felt like myself. Like the version of myself I actually want to be." I paused. "I think I love you. And I think, if I'm honest, I've been moving toward that for a very long time without knowing where I was going." The room was very quiet. Maya looked at me for a long moment. Long enough that I felt the particular vulnerability of someone who has said an honest thing and has no control over what happens next. And then her expression did something I had never seen it do before. Not in all the years, all the moments, all the versions of her I had witnessed across the full length of our friendship. It let go. Of what? I couldn't name it exactly. Some form of holding, some long-maintained guard against something she hadn't allowed herself to reach for. It simply let go. "Ethan," she said, softly, "I've been waiting for you to see it." "How long?" I asked. She smiled. The quiet kind that starts in the eyes. "Long enough," she said. And there it was, not an explosion. Not a revelation with dramatic lighting and a swelling soundtrack. Just two people, on an apartment floor, surrounded by work papers and takeout containers, and the comfortable debris of a real life, finally arriving at the truth that had been patient enough to wait for them. We talked for a long time after that, about all of it, about what we had both seen and not said, about what fear looks like when it disguises itself as practicality, about how strange it is to realize that the thing you needed most was never missing. It was just waiting for you to stop looking in the wrong direction. And somewhere in that conversation, in the honesty and the laughter and the occasional silence that didn't need filling, I felt the last of the heaviness in my chest begin, genuinely and finally, to lift. Not because my problems were over. They weren't. Vanessa's calls were still coming. Evan's consequences were still unfolding. The world was still messy and complicated and full of things requiring navigation. But sitting in that room with Maya, being seen by someone who had always known who I actually was, For the first time since that evening, with the roses and the necklace, and the terrible silence of a house that already knew, I felt something I had almost forgotten was available to me. Hope. Not the desperate, white-knuckled hope of a man chasing a dream in a dim room. The quiet, grounded, sustainable hope of a man who has found solid ground and decided to build something real on it. There is a version of this story that ends in the courtroom. The gavel comes down. The ruling is made. The villain is defeated. The hero walks out into the sunlight, victorious and whole, and the credits roll over a city that gleams like a reward. That version is cleaner, more satisfying in the immediate sense. The kind of ending that sits well in the chest, tidy, resolved, emotionally complete. But that is not what actually happens after a life falls apart and gets rebuilt. What actually happens is messier, slower, more human. What actually happens is you wake up the next morning, and the one after that, and you carry the past alongside the present, not because you are weak, but because that is what being a person costs. Because experience doesn't evaporate once it's been adjudicated. Because scar tissue, even when fully healed, is still a record of what the wound was. What actually happens is, life continues, in all its complicated, unglamorous, deeply real continuity. And what you do in that continuity, who you choose to be in the ordinary, unobserved, non-dramatic days that follow the dramatic ones, that is the actual measure of a person. That is the part of the story nobody sees, but it is the part that matters most. The calls from Vanessa started the week after the ruling. I had expected them. Patricia had warned me, had said, with the clinical matter-of-factness of someone who has navigated the emotional aftermath of many legal proceedings, that the period immediately following a ruling often produces a specific kind of desperation in the losing party. Not acceptance, not reflection, desperation. The particular panic of someone who has watched the door close and is suddenly, viscerally aware of what is on the other side of it. The first call came on a Tuesday morning while I was in the middle of a development meeting. I watched my phone screen light up on the table beside my laptop, her name, her number, the small rectangular pulse of it, and felt something I hadn't expected. Nothing. Not the hot pain of early betrayal, not the cold anger of the courtroom weeks, not even the complicated grief of someone processing a significant loss. Just nothing. The particular quiet of a man who has reached the far side of something. I declined the call, returned to the meeting. Did not think about it again until that evening, when I saw she had called 3 more times and sent a text message that read, "Ethan, please, I know I don't deserve this. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need you to know that I am so sorry. Not sorry because of what I lost, sorry because of what I did to you. You were good to me. You were always good to me, and I threw it away. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know that I know." I read it twice. Then I set the phone down, and I thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. Gave it the honest consideration it perhaps deserved. Because I had made a decision early in the aftermath of all this, that I would not become a person who was hardened by what had happened to me, that I would not let betrayal calcify into bitterness, that the measure of who I was would not be taken by what I had survived but by how I carried it. So I considered the message. I acknowledged, privately and without performance, that it cost her something to send it. That somewhere beneath all the construction and calculation of the person I had married, there was something human that had looked at what it had done and felt the weight of it. I considered all of that, and then I put the phone in a drawer, not in cruelty, not in triumph, in self-preservation, in the clear-eyed recognition that some doors, once closed, must stay closed, not because the person on the other side is irredeemable, but because reopening them would cost you something you cannot afford to spend. Because forgiveness, which I was slowly and genuinely working toward, does not require proximity, does not require response, does not require you to make yourself available to the thing that broke you in order to prove that you have healed from it. I could forgive Vanessa from exactly where I was, without a single word, and that, I was learning, was its own form of strength. Evan was a different matter. With Vanessa, there was grief, the loss of a person I had loved, the dismantling of a version of the future I had believed in. With Evan, what I felt was something that didn't have a clean name, something older and stranger and more specifically painful than what I felt about her. Because Vanessa had betrayed a husband, Evan had betrayed a brother. And those are not the same wound. The husband and wife bond, for all its weight and significance, is one that adults choose and construct. and can, however painfully, choose to deconstruct. But brotherhood, the particular bond of two people who began in the same womb, who share the same blood and the same face and the same origin story, that is not chosen. It simply is. And the betrayal of something that simply is carries a different kind of damage than the betrayal of something built. I had looked at my brother's face in that bedroom doorway, had seen the expression that lived beneath his usual confidence, beneath the flashy car and the easy money and the performance of a man who had always landed on his feet. And what I had seen there, in the brief moment before everything collapsed into confrontation and aftermath, was something that had stayed with me. He looked lost. Not guilty exactly. Not defiant. Lost. Like a person who had traveled so far down a road they knew was wrong that they had forgotten there was a way back, and had stopped looking for one. I did not call Evan, did not text, did not reach out in any form. But I thought about him more than I expected to, not with the consuming intensity of fresh anger that had burned through and left something quieter in its place, but with the slow, complicated process of someone trying to understand how a person they knew as a child, someone they had shared a room with, grown up alongside, loved in the uncomplicated way of children who haven't yet learned to protect themselves, becomes the person in that bedroom. I didn't have an answer. I'm not sure there is one, not a clean one. What I did know was this: I had two choices about what to carry forward. I could carry the version of Evan who had betrayed me, the one who had been in my home, in my bed, in my life with calculated dishonesty for 3 years. Or I could carry both, that version and the earlier one, the boy, the brother, the person before the choices that unmade him. I chose to carry both, not to excuse either, but because collapsing a person into their worst act is a thing I had seen done to me by Vanessa's lawyer in that courtroom. And I had no interest in doing it to anyone else, even someone who had earned it. Evan was more than what he had done. So was I. We were both going to have to figure out how to live with that. What happened to them in the months that followed was not something I orchestrated or sought or celebrated. It simply happened, the way consequences simply happen when the structures supporting an unsustainable situation are finally removed. Vanessa, without the financial settlement she had expected, found herself in a position she had not prepared for. She had spent 4 years, and considerably longer if her patterns before me were consistent, operating on the assumption that her particular gifts, her appearance, her confidence, her ability to make people feel chosen and special and seen, were a form of currency that would always be accepted, that there would always be someone to underwrite the life she wanted to live. What she discovered, in the quiet aftermath of the ruling, was that currency has exchange rates, and hers had changed. Evan, whose financial situation had always appeared more stable than it actually was, built as it was on deals and connections, and the particular momentum of a man who moved fast enough that the cracks beneath him never quite caught up, found himself in a period of significant contraction. The legal scrutiny that had arisen from the courtroom proceedings, and specifically from the documentation of his financial interference in my business dealings, created consequences in his professional world that his personality and charm could not entirely smooth over. His money slowed. His reputation, in the specific interconnected circles of Austin business where reputation is a form of capital, took damage that proved surprisingly hard to repair. And Vanessa and Evan, removed from the particular ecosystem of secrecy and mutual benefit that had sustained their relationship, discovered something that perhaps they had always known but never had to confront directly. What they had was not love. It was not even close to love. It was a shared arrangement that had served them both for a period of time. And arrangements, when they stop serving both parties equally, tend to dissolve. He left. She was alone. And the life she had chosen over the one she had, over the quiet, hard-working, genuinely devoted man who had come home with roses on their anniversary, turned out to be a life she had to rebuild from almost nothing. I did not feel victorious when I learned these things. I want to be precise about that, because it matters for reasons that go beyond this story. There is a version of a person who, upon hearing that the people who wronged them are struggling, feels satisfaction, vindication, the deeply human pleasure of a universe that has organized itself into justice. I will not pretend that something in me did not notice, did not register, the particular poetry of what had unfolded. But satisfaction? No. What I felt genuinely was something closer to sorrow. Not for myself, not anymore, but for the waste of it. for the amount of living that had been spent in deception and manipulation and the elaborate, exhausting performance of a life that wasn't real, for the years that Vanessa had spent investing in a strategy instead of a person, for whatever it was in Evan, whatever wound or fear or hunger that had made him capable of what he had done, sorrow for the waste. And then, because I was actively choosing who to be in the aftermath, I let it go. I built. That is what I did, what I have always done, what I will, I think, always do, because building is not just a professional habit. It is the closest thing I have to a native language, the way I process the world, the way I metabolize experience into something that has form and function and use. But the building that followed the aftermath was different from everything that had come before. For years, I had built from scarcity, from the particular energy of a man trying to prove something, to investors, to the world, to the version of himself that had grown up in that small house watching his father's chair stay empty. There is a power in that energy. It is real and it is effective, and it will drive you through obstacles that comfort would stop at. But it is also a fire that burns the person carrying it. What I built now, I built from something else, from clarity, from the specific freedom of a man who has lost the things he thought he needed and discovered that what remained, what had always been there beneath the constructed layers of a life built partly for appearance, was enough, more than enough, was in fact the actual foundation. The new platform I developed in the year following the divorce was different from my previous work, more human, built not around efficiency or disruption, the language of the industry I operated in, but around connection, around the specific problem of how people with ideas and no resources find people with resources and vision, a bridge between the versions of people who had been where I had been and the opportunities that had always felt just out of reach. It was, in the most honest sense, built from my own story, and it worked. Not immediately, nothing real works immediately, but steadily, verifiably, in the way of things built on actual foundation rather than manufactured momentum. Within 18 months, we had facilitated opportunities for over 2,000 people. Small businesses, independent developers, artists and builders and creators who had been doing exactly what I had done in that small apartment, working in the dark, trusting the process, waiting for someone to notice. I noticed, and I built something that helped them be noticed. The financial return was significant. More significant, ultimately, than the first deal. But the thing I returned to, the thing that sat differently in my chest than any number on a spreadsheet, was the emails, the messages, the stories people sent in describing the specific moment when something shifted, when they went from invisible to seen, from struggling to building. I read every one of them, and I thought, this is what it was all for. Not the betrayal, not the courtroom, not the evidence or the ruling or the 3 years of manufactured silence in my own marriage. All of it, every sleepless night in that small apartment, every rejection, every moment of doubt, every morning I woke at dawn to go back to a screen that showed me how far I still had to go. All of it had built the specific person who could build this specific thing. The worst chapters, it turned out, were the ones doing the most necessary work. Maya and I moved slowly, by choice, by design, by the mutual, unspoken understanding of two people who had both waited long enough for the right thing that they were not about to rush it now that it had arrived. She was present in my work the way she was present in everything, not loudly, not from the front, but fundamentally. She designed the platform's interface with an elegance and intuitiveness that I, for all my technical capability, could not have produced. She sat in on strategy meetings and said little until she said something that reoriented everything. She was the person I called when a decision was hard, not to be given an answer but to be heard in a way that usually led me to the answer myself. She was beside me, not behind, not ahead, beside. And I understood, in the daily experience of that, the difference between being supported and being witnessed, between having someone who believes in your success and someone who believes in you, in the actual specific irreplaceable you, independent of what you produce or achieve or accumulate. I had had one. I had not known I was missing the other. Now I had both. On an evening in early spring, windows open, the city doing its evening things outside, dinner plates pushed to one side of the table, I took something from my jacket pocket. Not a velvet box this time, not a performance. A ring I had chosen carefully, simply, with the same philosophy I had tried to bring to everything in this new chapter of my life, less display, more meaning. Maya looked at it, Then at me. "No speech," I said. "No grand gesture. You know everything already. You've known most of it longer than I have." She laughed. "The real one." "Is there a question somewhere in here?" she said. "Will you?" I said. She looked at me for a long moment, with those eyes that had always seen me clearly, through failure and grief and the long middle sections of a life that hadn't yet arrived at its best parts. "Yes," she said. One word. The same weight as a verdict. The same finality as a door closing on everything that came before. But this time, a beginning. "I am going to tell you something that I mean with every part of myself. The morning of the day I stood in a courtroom and watched the truth dismantle a lie, I thought that was the turning point, the pivot. The moment the story changed direction. I was wrong. The moment the story changed was earlier than that, much earlier. It was the night I came home with roses and found my life already unraveling. Because that night, that devastating, breathless, world-ending night, was not the destruction of my story. It was the first page of the real one. Everything I thought I had before that night, I did not lose it. I lost the illusion of it. The constructed, partially manufactured, carefully curated version of a life that looked right from the outside and had significant structural problems from within. I lost the marriage that had never been entirely what I believed it was. I lost the brother who had chosen, for reasons I may never fully understand, to become someone I didn't know. I lost the comfortable story I had been telling myself about what my life was and who was in it and what it all meant. And in losing all of that, I found everything. I found the work that actually mattered, the platform built from honesty rather than ambition, the company that grew because it was solving a real problem rather than performing innovation, the financial freedom that came not as a rescue from a struggling life, but as a byproduct of genuinely useful, genuinely meaningful work. I found myself, the actual version, not the one performing competence, not the one so buried in achievement that he forgot to look up, the one who could sit still, who could receive care without deflecting it, who could say "I love you" and "I was wrong" and "I need help" without those admissions feeling like failures. And I found Maya, who had been there all along, beside me, in every version of the story, waiting, with the extraordinary patience of someone who understood that some people need to travel the long way around before they can find their way home. Today, I do not wake up in a furnished studio with beige walls. I wake up in a home we chose together, full of color, full of light, full of the beautiful, imperfect accumulation of a shared life. There are books stacked in ways that only make sense to us. There is a coffee maker that she insists makes better coffee than any method I have ever tried. She is right. I have accepted this. There are plants she tends, and windows she opens in the morning, and a desk in the corner where I still work before sunrise sometimes, still chasing something, still building, but differently now, from fullness instead of hunger. Vanessa is somewhere living her life. I genuinely hope she finds something real in it, not because I owe her that hope, but because I refuse to spend the limited precious resource of my attention on wanting someone to suffer. Evan is somewhere doing the same. The door between us is not permanently locked, but it is closed, and it will remain closed until there is something genuine on the other side of it. Not performance, not strategy, something real. The people whose opportunities we've helped create are somewhere building their own things, adding to the world in ways I will never fully see, creating ripples I will never fully trace. And me, I am here, fully here, present in a way I was not for a long time capable of being. If you take nothing else from this story, from this long, messy, real account of a life that had to be broken before it could be built correctly, take this. The people who stay when there is nothing to gain from staying are not ordinary. They are rare in the specific way that genuine things are rare, not because the world lacks them, but because we are so often looking in the wrong direction to see them. Look up, look around, at the person who answers on the second ring, who opens the door without questions, who sits beside you in the dark and doesn't try to fix what can't be fixed, just refuses to leave you alone in it. That person, if you are lucky enough to have them, is not a supporting character in your story. They are the point of it. I built a company. I built a platform. I built a life from nothing in a city that didn't promise me anything. But the best thing I ever built was the courage to finally see what had been right in front of me and to choose it without hesitation, without looking back. How many of you would agree with me that Ethan and Maya were meant for each other? If you enjoyed this story, kindly comment below what story I should write next. Don't forget to like, share with your family and friends, and also subscribe for more interesting stories.